this video was originally going to be a little different than it currently is. I wanted to focus so hard on how the world has gotten so much better than it used to be 10 years ago. Then, the whole election happened. And after spending several days doom scrolling, trying to grasp some sort of semblance for an answer as to the whys, the hows, how in the world could we get to where we are right now. And then I remembered the script that I've been working on, the one that you're watching me speak right now. And I remembered exactly how we've gotten here. We've been here before, and it sucks that we're here again. We have the answers to what happened. I'm going to get into the video, and I want you to remember these problems existed then. They still exist now. Just in the very act of learning and acknowledging them, we can do something about it. Tell me about the worst breakup you've ever had. Did it involve cheating, lying? Did it end like mine did, with you placing him in a bear suit and sacrificing him to a god of a Swedish cult? No, wait, that's Midsommar. Did your friends weigh in on the worst breakup? How about the United Nations? Because if you ask Zoe Quinn, they may have the worst breakup story I have ever heard. So let's get into it. Let's talk about GamerGate and how it brought us to what really feels like the worst possible timeline. First things first, let me introduce myself. My name is Rebecca, or Ricky Faith Quinn. I am an autism advocate and crisis counselor for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. But do not let all of that smart talk fool you. I am actually still an autistic bimbo. All beauty and no brains. Or in autism language, all beauty and no trains. If the bimboification of autism and feminism is your vibe, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, because I'm building an army of bimbos and we're coming for the chicken nuggies. Now that you have totally subscribed to join the Bimbo Club, let me add a trigger warning for this video and tell you that we are going to be dealing with complicated and triggering subjects such as sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, harassment, transphobia, and racism. Just all the bad stuff. The only thing we're missing is Elon Musk. Then we'd have a trifecta of the worst. That joke was a lot funnier when I wrote it before the election. There will be resources linked below of crisis counselors like myself who can help you if you're too triggered to continue the video. I think a lot of us are in a very sensitive emotional space right now, and that is valid. You don't have to feel ashamed for being affected by things. You are only human. All sensitive topics will be censored, and though, yes, I hate doing it too, don't blame me, blame PewDiePie for dropping a slur and causing adpocalypse. With all that said, let's discuss GamerGate, which brought us to where we are now. For those who may not have experienced it firsthand, let me take you back to the internetosphere of 2014. Back in 2014, Katy Perry was in the genre of pop instead of just reoccurring flop. People were freaking out over the size of the iPhone 6 and how easily it could bend. And then there was one video that made a splash in the internet conversation, particularly about women's existence in today's society. Holla Back, a non-profit organization dedicated to ending street harassment, did a social experiment where a woman dressed in a simple black shirt and jeans and walked around New York for 10 hours. During the video, she experiences multiple instances of catcalling, sexual harassment, and even one random guy who follows her for several blocks. The response to Holla Back's video was pretty polarized. Many women shared how relatable they found the video, matching their experiences walking down the street in their hometowns. But for many others, particularly men, there was an intense backlash. Many men were shocked that this was the experience of so many women, something that they hadn't seen or known about in themselves. But then, many men were enraged by the video, stating that most of the interactions shouldn't be labeled as sexual harassment, but instead were just men being friendly. Can I hire a killer clown to follow you for several blocks? Don't worry. It's nothing bad. It's just clowns being friendly. Holla Back's video went majorly viral, with parody after parody and reaction video after reaction video. With all the think pieces and angry responses, it was a microcosm of the conversations starting up at the time about women in public spaces, professional, online, or otherwise. That same year, this subject began circulating heavily with the gaming industry, with a big push for discussions of ethics in journalism regarding on reporting female-led games and game creators. Suddenly on Twitter, articles popped up everywhere referencing some sort of ethics violation using the hashtag Quinspiracy. The hashtag was apparently for the discourse surrounding a review of a game by creator Zoe Quinn and a potential lapse in journalistic ethics at the hands of the author of said review, Nathan Grayson. But wait, didn't we say before that this was all about a breakup? Who are these people? What do they have to do with GamerGate? Well, let me introduce to you the people of the GamerGate saga. Before we get into who GamerGate's primary willing or unwilling participants were, what even was GamerGate? Let's define it. GamerGate was an online harassment campaign from 2014 to 2015, primarily targeted at women in the gaming industry, all justified as a campaign to uplift ethics in journalism. Several key players were involved throughout the time span of GamerGate, many of whom were victims, some of whom were bad actors. I will be doing my best to share the victims' stories, but some of these people involved caused this abuse to escalate to the point of potentially costing people's lives. Even within that category, some are more guilty than others, but we'll get into that. The most well-known victims of GamerGate saga were Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian. There were other people who were large primary targets like Brianna Wu or Jen Frank, but I'm not going to be quite delving into their stories, especially with the ways that Brianna Wu in particular has weaponized her experiences in GamerGate to justify her stances on transphobia and Zionism. Those harmful beliefs don't make anything that happened to her in the GamerGate saga less real and don't justify what she went through, but I thought it important to mention why I personally did not feel comfortable discussing her at length in this video, given she was also not centered at the campaigns to the same extent that Zoe Quinn or Anita Sarkeesian were. All of these women were named as targets by the people perpetuating the harassment online, doing so through websites like 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit. Since they were anonymous posting, they could share the online places where people could find the women in order to send them hate, or in the worst case, the physical locations of these women to help people promote legitimate fear for their lives. But why? Why did all that happen? For that, let's start with the one who incited the event. Erin Joney was an independent programmer who began a consensual relationship with Zoe Quinn in December of 2013. Important to note, though Zoe Quinn identified as a woman at the time, they have since stated that they prefer they-them pronouns, and so that will be respected in this video. Zoe and Erin had a purportedly on-again, off-again relationship during this time where they only saw each other once a week and took frequent romantic breaks. Like many relationships when you're in your early 20s, theirs was a brief and toxic, all-consuming kind with a fiery end. The two had an explosive breakup in May of 2014, and according to Quinn, their last estual encounter left them with bruises all over their body, something that was confirmed by a third person later. Months later, on August 16th of that same year, Erin released a blog post that would shake the world. The infamous Zoe post. The Zoe post is a 9,000-word diatribe explaining the last several months of the two's relationship from the perspective of Erin himself. He acknowledges that at several points when the two were on a break, Zoe slept with other men, purportedly multiple other men, including gaming journalist Nathan Grayson, who worked for a site called Kotaku. Throughout the post, Erin included lewd jokes and reenactments of their conversations, with some provided screenshots that back up portions of the things that he claimed happened between the two. He also continuously described Zoe with derogatory language, calling Zoe Five Guys, Burgers, and Fries, in reference to both the restaurant and the number of men that Zoe purportedly slept with. After posting the Zoe post, Joney shared it on websites like 4chan, Reddit, and the forum called Something Awful. All of these, again, anonymous posting sites filled with people who call themselves comedians, but for the most part, they just spend their time trolling everyone by posting racial slurs and homophobia. The post went viral on all three sites, despite being deleted from Reddit for violating community guidelines. Once anonymous chatters had read Erin's tale of Zoe's alleged misdeeds, people signal boosted the post as much as possible. Zoe had already been on the radar of many in the gaming community for a while after the publication of their indie game Depression Quest, which was popularly received publicly and also critically. Many of the gamers in the anonymous posting sites felt as though this text-based interactive fiction game about a person spiraling into a deep depression was a political invasion of the gaming world. especially since it had been done by a self-proclaimed feminist like Zoe. So when it came out that the angry feminists they hated, who made that political game that tortured them, might have done some dark things in their past, people jumped at the opportunity to punish Zoe. Nathan Grayson, one of the men that Zoe had purportedly cheated with, was a journalist who reported on indie games. That fact, combined with some hinting from Joni in his initial Zoe post, people began to spread the narrative that Zoe had slept with Grayson in exchange for a positive review for Depression Quest. This is where the narrative came from, that GamerGate was all about ethics in journalism. It all came from one post. Because Lord knows a woman or woman-perceived people can't just get a positive review for making a good game. No, we had to have given some sexual favors for it. Pay no mind, though, to the fact that Grayson never even reviewed Zoe's game. Aaron later corrected this idea, saying that the misconception came from a typo in his initial post. And there is a pattern right there that I noticed when I did research on this subject. While Aaron did make somewhat of an effort to correct the specific claim that Zoe did not sleep with Grayson in order to get a positive review, Aaron never corrected the idea that GamerGate was about ethics in journalism. Because how could it be about ethics in journalism if the ethics violation in question never happened? This is a pattern with Aaron's responses to his participation in the GamerGate movement. When people would misunderstand his initial problem or point, he would say, "Oh yeah, my bad." But then he would never make an effort beyond that to correct the misinformation and would continue to share and retweet articles that perpetuated it without correcting anything that was misinformed. He would say that he didn't support the harassment against Zoe, but then would participate in internet relay chats where people had set up to plan targeted harassments against them. Aaron would say that he did this solely to discuss ethics in gaming journalism, but then admitted multiple interviews with journalists that the ethics violation in question, again, never happened. In fact, the positive coverage that Nathan Grayson had given Zoe for other projects were all published before Nathan and Zoe had purportedly slept together. There was nothing for Nathan to need to disclose at that time. Aaron knew that and had purposefully included a false implication in order to get the gaming community's attention. It's no secret that the Zoe post was planned. Aaron himself had said multiple times online and in several interviews that he had worked on it for months, writing and rewriting it, admitting in interviews that he wanted to lean into the bitter ex-boyfriend trope and use video gaming analogies to get the attention of Zoe's gaming colleagues. Given that Aaron had gone to multiple speaking events during their relationship where Zoe had talked about their experiences with harassment in online gaming, it sounds as though Aaron knew exactly what words to say and what buttons to press in order to send the hate mob after Zoe. And don't get me wrong, I wasn't there. I don't know whether cheating did or didn't happen. But when you constantly admit to purposefully leading people in the wrong direction in order to get a reaction, how am I supposed to believe that what you are saying is truthful? At that point, it becomes extremely clear to me. This post and the jubilation afterward were done with the sole intent to cause as much damage to Zoe as possible. And while we will get to Zoe's story, it didn't stop with just one person. Aaron's actions caused a catastrophic explosion within the gaming community, and other innocent people got caught in the fallout. Anita Sarkeesian is a Canadian-American feminist and media critic, and also founder of a nonprofit organization, along with a YouTube channel titled Feminist Frequency, which is entirely dedicated to discussing the intersections of feminism within media. Unlike me, who does it in a bimbo way, Feminist Frequency does things, in like a smart people way, with a BA in communications and a master's in political thought. Listen, I never claimed to be a smart autistic. I have in fact claimed the opposite on multiple occasions. In 2012, after doing many speaking events where she talked about women and tropes in media, Anita was so inspired to start a video series on her YouTube channel specifically aiming to discuss gender tropes in gaming. And feeling that the series would need a decent budget to do it properly, she started a Kickstarter campaign for $6,000. Since the nature of this series was a rather feminist one that aimed to discuss and dissect sexist themes and tropes within popular games like Grand Theft Auto, it got her on the radar of the gaming community, and not in a good way. Anita was met with massive amounts of threats, both for SA and unaliving. Yes, I hate that I have to censor the word too. I don't make the rules, I just play by them. And listen, were there some valid criticisms of her content? Yes, absolutely. Particularly in some instances where she may have misrepresented the game Hitman and whether or not a person was rewarded for unaliving women. Though, personally, I think the issue is with her wording. That's still a valid criticism for people to have. And she, as the creator, was responsible to be more thorough in her wording of her critiques. However, that aside, a few bad takes on your favorite game does not justify the violent rhetoric and threats she received. The negative responses to her campaign wound up bringing it even more attention, causing it to not only reach its goal of $6,000 in less than a day, but eventually exceed it and raise $158,000 by the end of its run. Anita would begin publishing the series Tropes vs. Women in Gaming in March of 2013. To no one's surprise, many men in the gaming community were livid. Though the harassment of Anita Sarkeesian began before GamerGate, it had died down for a while, leaving Anita to continue writing and researching her content and focusing her next portion of her series for the channel, Women as Background Decoration. Unfortunately for Anita, her second part of this series would go live on August 25th, only 2 weeks after Aaron Joni's publication of the Zoe post, and gamers were ready to pounce. By August 26th, the harassment had gotten so bad that Anita had contacted the FBI, and by August 27th, the unaliving threats had gotten so bad that she was forced to leave her home. Within 2 days of her posting her video discussing women in gaming tropes, she had to leave her home because people were threatening her life and the life of her family. Let me ask a weird question that I really didn't think needed to be asked, but I guess we're at that point. When did we wrap our identities so tightly around the media that we like that this became a normal response? You know that people criticizing something you enjoy is not an attack on you, right? Like, Rent has some of the worst main characters in all of musical theater. And guess what? It still has some great music and messages that have vibed with people throughout the ages, and that's okay. You're allowed to like things that are flawed on some level, or are even just plain bad. Why else would I have watched Dragonheart or Quest for Camelot on a non-stop loop as a teen? And more than that, when I was going through her videos for the research done on this video, like, honestly, for the most part, she was right. There was a long-standing practice of women in games being little more than background dressing, with our bodies being used solely to give the games an edgy look, either through being sexualized or being straight up unalived. We can't deny that this was a common thread. And yes, while there was the occasional Tomb Raider with a female lead, let's not lie to ourselves and say that that was the norm in video games up until relatively recently. Anita's critiques were, for the most part, right. But maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. After all, I'm an annoying shark enthusiast with a bachelor's degree in acting and a passion for feminism. So what do I know? Well, let's hear from someone who knows a lot more about games than I do. Neil Druckmann, creator of one of my favorite games of all time, The Last of Us, Parts 1 and 2, and also the Uncharted series, even said upon watching Anita's videos that he thought she was right. Her perspective gave him something to think about and apply to how he wrote his games. He later went on to say that the reason The Last of Us is the powerhouse story that it was is because of the women on the team of that game and what Anita had said. You may know a lot about making games, but do you know more than a man whose games have won over 400 video game awards, not to mention the Emmys that he won for the Last of Us TV series? Anita Sarkeesian was pointing out an uncomfortable gaming truth, something people didn't want to think about because games are supposed to be an escapist fantasy and people didn't want that bubble popped. So in response, they doxed her address, sent her unaliving threats and essay threats, and even went so far as to create a game with an avatar of her that people could assault and essay. Because the perfect response to a woman criticizing violence against women's bodies in a video game is to create a video game where you can do violence against her body. That makes all the sense. I get that people want to live in their video game fantasies. Like, why else would I play The Sims for 12 to 24 hours a day? Okay, it's 48. But why does your escapist fantasy have to include violence being done against women's bodies? Why is that something so necessary for you to keep in? What purpose does it serve you in the product to see women's bodies be mutilated? Because I know for me, that's not fantasy escapism. For me as a woman, those are my worst fears. Something that I have to be afraid and think about in my everyday life. I don't get to escape from that. So why do you want to escape into it? And why does it upset you that people like me want to have fantasy escapism too? Anita Sarkeesian's harassment unfortunately did not stop with just doxing and unaliving threats. Anita Sarkeesian, like many people who work as media critics, also had numerous speaking events where she would discuss the nature of feminism in gaming and how to make gaming industries safer for female developers. Unfortunately, many of those speaking events had to be cancelled due to literal bomb threats. Here's where I have to ask, when did we wrap our entire identities so tightly around the things that we like that even the mildest of criticism somehow justifies not only unaliving the person giving the critique, but also innocent people? Because if those bombs were to have been real and gone off, that wouldn't just affect her. That would affect the hundreds of innocent people around her. So you're willing to harm them just because she called your game sexist? Like, seriously, how do you equate the two of those in your head? When people tell you they don't like your favorite thing, you can just, ignore them? Did that thought not occur to you? But how did we get to this point? How did it escalate this bad to the point where people thought this was okay? Well, for that answer, we're going to have to look towards our next part. Milo Yiannopoulos is a right-wing reactionary journalist who is primarily known for his advocacy against feminism, even starting the hashtag #FeminismIsCancer, where he perpetuated the claim that feminism is a form of female chauvinism. According to Milo Yiannopoulos, the gender pay gap isn't real, women don't face systemic discrimination, and catcalling isn't sexual harassment, it's just men being men. Milo Yiannopoulos also argues that feminists are mean, vindictive sociopaths, and men are actually the ones who are oppressed by women. I got it. Milo Yiannopoulos was basically Andrew Tate before podcasts and TikTok were a thing. He was the blueprint. He is a right-wing troll who enjoys getting any sort of attention, whether it is negative or not. And that's not even just me putting that label on him because I hate him. I mean, I do. But that's his own definition of himself and his methods. Milo Yiannopoulos started his career when Steve Bannon hired him to work for Breitbart Media. Yes, Steve Bannon, another notably right-wing reactionary who designed Trump's America First campaign, stole money from people donating to a border wall, and then last year was sued in order to pay $500,000 in legal fees to the lawyers who represented him in the previous cases. He wound up even serving prison time. Oh, we love to see it. I'd love to see more of it, please. Steve Bannon owned Breitbart Media around the time GamerGate started, and having been involved in gaming industries before through World of Warcraft gold farming companies, yes, that's a real thing. Bannon had observed a group of people in the gaming community that he considered rootless white males. Seeing an opportunity with GamerGate, he hired Milo Yiannopoulos as an editor to write content about the tech gaming industries for Breitbart Media. Milo then began creating and promoting pro-GamerGate articles, twisting the narrative that GamerGate wasn't about a hate campaign launched against one woman, but was actually a concern about free speech. Not even the ethics violation that it was before. Now it's a free speech issue. Angry feminists were trying to censor and control games, and men were rightfully pushing back on that by doxing and swatting these women, sending them essay threats and the like. For those who really weren't online at the time, this was the real start of those angry blue-haired feminist memes, which then became the default response to, again, just the most mild of criticism of gaming. Milo Yiannopoulos, with his large Twitter following only growing during this time, used that large platform to bring the GamerGate harassment campaign into the mainstream, with his twisted narrative of the situation only amplifying the threats against the victims of GamerGate, and also at the same time solidifying the narrative that the women who received doxing threats, essay threats, were the actual bullies. He even went so far as to claim that many of the threats against the women were exaggerated, and that if there were any real threats, it wasn't to the feminists. It was actually to the pro-Gamergaters. Any threats to pro-Gamergate were real threats, but discussions of threats against women in gaming were an attempt of censorship of pro-Gamergate. Listen, I'm not going to say that threats against pro-Gamergaters weren't happening at all, since that would be like an overgeneralization and a potential denial of people's experiences. But I will say that there is no evidence that it was happening on the scale it was happening to the women. If I'm being fully honest, like full transparency here, Milo Yiannopoulos is a full-on misogynist. Now, you may be saying, Ricky, Milo is gay. That means he can't be a misogynist. Oh, you sweet summer child. Unfortunately, that's not the way that works. First off, people who experience misogyny can also perpetuate it. That's what internalized misogyny is. If you've ever had one of those "I'm not like other girls" phase, then guess what? That was probably from internalized misogyny. I know mine was. God damn it, past me, put down the fedora! And second off, Milo Yiannopoulos is a cisgendered man. Gay cisgendered men do not experience misogyny. In fact, some cis gay men perpetuate misogyny due to the belief that separating oneself away from women provides them with some sort of safety within a patriarchal society. And listen, that's not just me bringing up the patriarchy because I'm an annoying feminist. I mean, I am, but people like Milo agree that we are living in a patriarchy that values men's contributions over women's. The only difference is, they think that's a good thing. They like it. They want more of it. Let's get more patriarchy.
You know what? Lion tastes good. Let's go get some more lion.
Because for people like Milo, it means they can hold on to whatever little power they have, even though they themselves come from a marginalized status. Milo Yiannopoulos was instrumental in creating and amplifying the blueprint of online reactionary politics. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Do I mean that reactionary politics weren't a thing before this? No, absolutely not. However, in online spaces, reactionary politics were usually sectioned off into relatively less public ones, such as 4chan, where we saw the development of both the hacktivist group Anonymous and also the extreme alt-right at the exact same time, both of which could be considered reactionary in some way. Yeah, Anonymous started on 4chan, that's not a joke, that's really where they came from. It was relatively rare that any sort of online discourse would become mainstream news, even when the threats made on some of these platforms would lead to actual violence against people, such as multiple incidents of unalivers posting their plans onto 4chan before enacting them in real life, including the Isla Vista sorority shooting that happened earlier in 2014, just before the beginning of GamerGate. Online reactions and discourse were rarely acknowledged by mainstream media as they were considered to be invalid. However, with Milo using Breitbart Media, a legitimate news organization, The Onion is probably more legitimate than they are in their satire. It brought the conversation into the mainstream, bringing in people who very rarely participated in gaming or were even online at all. This is how we got subjects like woke culture or cancel culture to be normalized and presented on Fox News like it's the plague. Thanks to Milo, the internet was brought into the public eye and thus the real world. From here on out, every internet debate about marginalized groups was televised for all the world to see. But here's the thing, the beautiful thing. The most glorious thing. Through implementing his system of weaponizing news sources to increase online discourse, Milo was setting up the very system that would tear him down. You see, after GamerGate had ended and lost its relevance, Milo Yiannopoulos used his newfound fame to bring in new followers of his to the alt-right agenda, promoting himself as a warrior against political correctness. He prided himself on his ability to get a reaction from people on the left by creating tours like the dangerous F-slur tour, but as many trolls do, he got a little too comfortable with the things he thought he could say and get away with. You see, in early 2017, 1 year after he was rightfully banned from Twitter for making horrendously racist comments about actress Leslie Jones, Milo was looking up in the world. He was doing speaking tours, he had a book deal coming up, and he even got invited to speak at CPAC, a major political event for conservative candidates. But then, like so many men, he got on a podcast. If toxic men could just stop with the podcasts, that'd be great. On February 21st of 2017, several videos were published of Milo being interviewed on podcasts where he defended what he called coming-of-age relationships in the gay community, where one partner is an adult and the other is underage. And if you're asking yourself, hey, doesn't that sound like something that rhymes with schmedophilia? Why, yes, you very intelligent person, you are right, because it is schmedophilia. But not according to Milo.
According to Milo, schmetophilia is only attraction to people who are prepubescent, and so if you're 13 or older, it's totally fine and consensual to be with someone who's, in their 30s. I want to make it very, very clear here. Gay people, as a whole, are not groomers. I know that term has been weaponized recently in discussions of the LGBTQ movement. But the gay community is not here to groom your children. We in the LGBTQ community are just trying to live our lives in a world that says that we shouldn't exist. But this rhetoric supports grooming. Milo himself admitted with his statement that he is totally on board with grooming. And I'm not the only one who thinks so either. In fact, even Republicans seem to think so, as after this, he basically was excommunicated from public conservative movements. With his book deal being cancelled, he was forced to resign from Breitbart Media, and his invitation to speak at CPAC was rescinded. Milo Yiannopoulos was instrumental in setting up the formula for what we now call cancel culture, which is the thing that would wind up taking him down. And while in many ways accountability culture can be mistaken for cancel culture, that was not the case with GamerGate. GamerGate was never about accountability. Violence is not accountability. It never has been and it never will be. GamerGate was about punishment for perceived wrongs, and it all started with the punishment of one person. And yeah, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's talk about Zoe Quinn. Zoe Quinn, who again now uses they/them pronouns, is a game developer known primarily for the game Depression Quest, a text-based style choose-your-own adventure which places you, the player, in the story as a person spiraling into depression. As the game goes on, healthy choices such as going out, speaking to friends, and hanging with a romantic partner become less and less available, forcing you to only continue into a severe depressive episode. The game, for the most part, was praised by critics and players alike for being a relatively realistic representation of depression, especially since it was inspired by the very real-life experiences of its creators. Unfortunately, there was also a very loud minority of people who criticized the game for its overly simplistic style and the fact that it was created by someone who identified as an outspoken feminist. One of those is a fair opinion to have. I'll let you pick which one it was. After the publishing of Depression Quest, Zoe got their first experience of being the subject of a hate campaign, and though this one was drastically smaller in comparison to what would come to them later, it still had an effect on them. Zoe wound up facing high levels of sexism and misogynistic responses from those who didn't like the game, leading them to become a public speaker about their experiences with misogyny in the gaming industry. As I mentioned before, Aaron Joni actually came to several of Zoe's speaking events, so he definitely knew what tactics had been used against them in previous experiences. Zoe would later describe their relationship with Aaron as abusive, particularly within the last several weeks, with the abuse sometimes becoming physical, especially in the later months. As I mentioned in the Aaron Joni section, this was corroborated by a third person whom Zoe had come to after the abuse happened, with that person stating that he could see the bruises on Zoe's arms. After the physical incident, the two broke up for good, with Zoe feeling as though they were finally free. Unfortunately for Zoe, as I've spoken about before, when people are in a toxic or abusive relationship, the most dangerous time for the victim is often when they make the decision or an attempt to leave the relationship. This is when the most abuse, or rather, the most dangerous and deadly abuse, happens, with 75% of DV homicides happening after the victim made an attempt to leave. Luckily for Zoe, this would not end in a homicide, but with what happened next, that might not have been a certainty for them. When Aaron's blog post against Zoe went viral, they were temporarily staying at a hostel with their partner at the time, Alec, who was working under contract in Paris. The response to Zoe from those on 4chan was swift and deadly. Almost immediately, Zoe's contact information was doxed in online forums, and they began receiving crank calls with people calling them burgers and fries in reference to a joke that Aaron had made in the post about the restaurant, Five Guys Burgers and Fries, and the number of men that Zoe had supposedly slept with. This would escalate to not only the doxing of Zoe's family, with their father's contact information being doxed as well, but people also began mailing dead animals to their home addresses. People made video games with avatars designed to look like Zoe just so the player could assault or essay an animated version of them, just like what happened with Anita Sarkeesian. And if Zoe was thinking of trying to find communities with friends, the harassers of GamerGate made sure that wasn't an option. Any of Zoe's friends or colleagues who tweeted or publicly said anything in support of Zoe received the same treatment as they did, with many victims of GamerGate not even being involved, but just saying words of support for a stranger who they saw was going through pain. It wasn't limited to just supporters of Zoe either. When making the decision to make this video, I actually invited several women who are around in the gaming or nerd spaces to share their experiences. These weren't people in community with Zoe, these were just random women who happened to get caught in the crossfires of a crusade that was supposedly about an ethics violation in journalism. An ethics violation that none of these innocent people had committed. And even if they had, I usually hate to play devil's advocate, but let's just play a little devil's advocate here. Let's just say it was true that Zoe had cheated on Aaron with Nathan, and in response, Nathan gave them a positive game review. First, why did Nathan not receive any of the harassment that Zoe had, given that he was the journalist and therefore responsible for the disclosure of personal relationships? And even if Zoe had committed the ethics violation in question, how in any way does the treatment they received hold them accountable? What changes would unaliving and doxing threats make in game reporting or disclosing the nature of relationships between game developers and game journalists? Because from where I'm standing, sending dead animals in the mail and creating avatars that you can beat in SA does nothing to make gaming a more ethical place. It only serves as an outlet for someone's anger against women and people of other marginalized genders simply for the sin of not being men. In September of 2014, Zoe filed for a restraining order against Aaron Joney, which was granted by the Boston Municipal Court, establishing that Aaron Joney was now forbidden from publicly discussing Zoe in any way, shape, or form online. This is what current law considers a no calls, annoying texts type of restraining order or a no contact order, which are becoming more and more commonplace. At the time in 2014, this was actually a lucky break that Zoe was able to get one at all, despite them having to go through the hoops of traveling from state to state in order to find the correct jurisdiction. The internet was still a relatively new phenomenon back then, despite the fact that most of us were already starting to become chronically online, watching hours and hours of Markiplier or Five Nights at Freddy's. Okay, maybe that was just me. But in 2014, the internet was only barely starting to become integrated into our everyday lives. It was seen as completely separate from the real world. Even in Zoe's case, they struggled to find judges who understood the impact this was having on their life, with one judge even telling them, if the internet is this bad, I think you should log off. And when Zoe pushed back, saying that the internet is literally their job, the judge allegedly responded with, "You're a smart girl. You'll find a new job." This is victim blaming, and completely disregarding the ways in which the harassment started by Aaron Joney had already bled over into Zoe's non-internet side of life. You can't log off from receiving dead animals in the mail. You can't log off from unaliving threats. You can't log off from the internet when the internet has become synonymous with real life. After the restraining order was established, Aaron Joney began raising money through GoFundMe for legal fees, arguing that asking him not to discuss Zoe Quinn and their relationship infringed upon his First Amendment rights to free speech. GoFundMe wound up pulling the donation campaign from the site before he had reached his goal, though at that point Aaron had already withdrawn a substantial amount in order to pay for his legal fees in fighting said restraining order. This led to months and months of Aaron taking Zoe back to court in order to appeal the restraining order, arguing once more that it was infringing upon his freedom of speech. This forced Zoe to continuously have to go back to court month after month to face the person who had physically abused them and also subjugated them to the worst internet harassment campaign the world had seen at that point. And for them to have to beg the courts to see why this man should not be allowed to harass them indefinitely. The tactic used by Aaron here is one that many abusers take, known as legal abuse, in which after the victim has left the abusive situation, the abuser will often weaponize the legal system as a means of maintaining some sort of control over their victim, whether that's through custody battles, private lawsuits, or in some worst case scenarios, false allegations of abuse or assault. This form of abuse not only forces the actual victim to face their abuser in person repeatedly, as our court system provides all of us the right to face our accusers, but it can also be physically, emotionally, and financially draining on the victim as well. Court is not cheap, even with governmental support, and having to appear in court repeatedly takes time off of work. And if you have children, there's the cost of childcare while you're in court. As somebody who has not only advocated for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, but also somebody who's been through it myself with the court system involving stalking, it's exhausting. This sentiment was echoed by Zoe Quinn themselves. In August 2015, 1 year after the GamerGate harassment campaign had started, Zoe advocated to vacate the restraining order entirely. It had become too exhausting to constantly get dragged back to court as Aaron Joney continued to try an appeal based off of the First Amendment. But at the same time, the restraining order also did nothing to truly stop the harassment Zoe was facing, thanks to Aaron. Sure, Aaron could stop saying Zoe's name online, but that didn't mean he couldn't amplify the voices of those trying to harass Zoe. That didn't mean that other people who had been harassing Zoe had to stop. That didn't even end the articles written by people like Milo Yiannopoulos, who only continued the harassment campaign long after most social media stories would have ended. The restraining order was just no longer worth the effort in Zoe's eyes, and honestly, I can see why. Zoe Quinn would go on to do some amazing things, such as speaking at the United Nations about online harassment, creating a non-profit organization to help survivors of online harassment, and even writing a novel, Crash Override, telling their story from their own perspective. But, unfortunately, the harassment that they received, while it died down drastically, it never fully went away. For a while, it seemed as though Zoe would be able to exist beyond the harassment campaign until 2019, when the hashtag #MeToo movement was in full swing. The hashtag #MeToo movement is a movement started online similar to GamerGate, but this time with a focus on having victims of abuse and sexual harassment and SA be able to share their stories of what happened to them. While there are a few bad actors who weaponized this movement with false allegations, for the most part, it allowed a lot of survivors to be seen and led to actual repercussions for some, including people like Harvey Weinstein, who was found guilty of multiple accounts of SA and has since been sentenced to prison. We love to see it. In fact, we'd love to see more of it. Zoe took the advantage of the safety given to other survivors sharing stories and decided to share their own experience of abuse with their partner Alex Hawaka, different than their partner Alec. Alex Hawaka was a game developer, and Zoe alleged that he, during their relationship, committed several acts of DV and SA against them. This resulted in Alex Hawaka being fired from his job, and in response, only days later, he would wind up taking his own life. This is one of those times where I'm going to ask everyone to put on their nuance caps. And remember, several things can be true at once. We can believe Zoe's story because we believe survivors, and Alex Hawaka did not deserve to end his life. Unfortunately, many people were not able to hold two things true at the same time, and Zoe Quinn once again found themselves at the center of backlash and controversy, with many blaming Zoe for Alex's death, even going so far as to say that Zoe had killed him themselves, which is just not true. Survivors are allowed to come forward about abuse at any time, and the only responsibility that survivors have for that abuse is the responsibility to heal from it. That's it. For some, this seemed to be one victimization too many, causing people to doubt Zoe's sincerity as a survivor, because after all, everyone knows that someone who is abused by more than just one person is lying about it, right? No, of course not. In fact, studies actually show that being a victim of abuse once already increases the chance of being a victim of that same kind of abuse again. Brains are complicated. Trauma is complicated, and many people, myself included, along with many of the victims of abuse I've worked with in my advocacy, are multi-time survivors of abuse. Unfortunately, many people online are not educated about the complicated nature of abuse or surviving it, and Zoe received such severe backlash that they pretty much completely retreated from the internet altogether, which might seem like a sad ending, and in a way it might be. But for Zoe, that was likely the best choice for them in order to maintain their mental and physical well-being, and that is all that matters. I've been working on the script for roughly 6 months at this point, not just researching, but writing and then rewriting and filming and then refilming. And the problem that I kept coming across was in the writing, I was just so angry. I'm so angry that this happened and that it was allowed to happen. And at first it felt like I had nowhere to put that anger and nothing to do with it. I mean, should it go to Aaron for starting this whole mess? Should it go to Milo Yiannopoulos for weaponizing the harassment of women in order to elect Donald Trump and send us on this hellscape of a timeline we are currently living in, where we are about to go through it again? Should it go to all of those many people who harassed these women in the name of ethics in journalism? And while, yes, anger is a valid response to almost all of those people, but it's also not productive. What good is my anger if I just stop there? It's valid to feel it, but more importantly, what can I do with that anger once I've felt it? I could make an entire video complaining about all of the bad actors involved, and while that may do some work in educating people on the story of GamerGate, it does nothing for the victims. It does nothing for Anita, for Zoe, or for the many, many nameless victims who received harassment and unaliving threats despite not even being involved. And it does nothing for the future victims, because not only has this happened again since, it's still happening now, over the smallest of slights. So rather than asking, who do we blame? I want to ask, how can we help? One of the biggest ways we can help is to understand that no one deserves harassment, no matter what their sins. Harassment is not accountability. Harassment is not and never will be the same thing as accountability. This level of harassment has long-term effects on people, including post-traumatic stress disorder, skill regression, or long-term mental and physical health issues. Harassment is not accountability because accountability is about acknowledging wrongdoings with an action plan of how to be better. And no, telling someone to just unalive themselves is not included in that. Learn to identify the signs of a harassment campaign so you yourself won't be duped into participating in it. The next way to help is to understand how to talk to victims experiencing massive online harassment. Listen to them. Don't judge. Don't tell them to just log off. Don't tell them to just not read the comments. These statements can seem like they're being made with the best intentions, but in many cases they're invalidating. For some, the trauma doesn't stop when they log off the internet. And for others, especially disabled people, online communities are our only form of community at all. So asking us to just not read the comments or to just log off is literally telling us to isolate ourselves further than we already are, which is what abusers want. There is a way to advocate for a healthy level of disengagement, but completely, it's just not doable for everyone, especially for those of us who create content and live our professional lives online. If you're witnessing someone go through this and you want to help, the first thing to do is help them regulate their emotions. What they're going through is real. Their pain is valid. How do we feel that pain without being drowned by it? Maybe engage in some distress tolerance skills or some dialectical behavioral therapy, but do not belittle what they are going through. It is real and it is happening to them. And if you yourself are going through this, there are things that you can do to help protect yourself. Many social media websites have filters where you can establish what words you don't want to see. So if there is a particular word that people keep using and spamming within your comment section as a part of the harassment, you can add that word to the filter and people won't be able to comment that anymore. I would also recommend adding misspelled versions of that word as well, since people try to be clever and get around those comment filters. And of course, be sure to add your personal information on those filters as well, so people have way less ways to dox you. You can also use block features, especially from sites like Meta, who block not only the account in question, but they also block any account they may create using the same phone or contact information. If there's a particular post causing the harassment, you can always disable commenting on it. It won't stop people entirely from accessing it, but it can be beneficial in slowing down a lot of the harassment you may be receiving. These are tools I've had to learn over my time as a content creator, dealing with as much harassment as I've dealt with. And of course, sometimes the harassment does not stay online, and it's important to know that you still have options. Though laws on cyberstalking and online harassment were few and far between back in 2014, in recent years there have been many efforts made by advocates such as myself who work with DV survivors, whose abusers often use the same tactics as these online hate campaigns in order to maintain control on their victims. If you feel as though you are experiencing cyberstalking or in-person stalking, the first thing you should do is document it. Any suspicious text, email, call, DM, or comment that you think may be from your abuser, You can document that, screenshot it, keep it in a folder. Any sort of suspicious package that comes to your door, do not accept it, but document it. Any calls you don't recognize, document them. Once you've documented all of these things, you can bring them to the nearest domestic violence agency and ask them for an advocate to help you report your abuser to the police. If you don't know who your abuser is in order to report, you can also do things to protect yourself at home if you really feel afraid, such as purchasing a Ring doorbell to see if someone you don't recognize comes to your door. Or an even more reliable option is also just get a dog. That's not even a joke. Domestic violence advocates and police officers alike both agree that the cheapest and easiest deterrent for stalkers or break-ins is getting a dog. And it can also help fight the isolation and loneliness that comes along with experiencing this type of abuse and harassment. Plus, new friend. It can also be beneficial to share your location with someone you trust and come up with a safe word that you can text them if you feel unsafe. This can alert them to keep an eye on you and your location and document it for you so you don't have to worry about it in the moment. And if you or someone you know is experiencing this, one of the most helpful things you can do is just to talk about it. Don't let it fester. Don't belittle your own emotions about it. Talk about it. There's crisis hotlines and text lines like the ones I've included in the description down below that can help you work through your feelings as you're going through it. I know it's hard, but you don't have to go through this alone. You can get support, and you deserve support. Please do not hesitate to reach out. You matter. Doing all the research and seeing the effects that GamerGate had on the world honestly made me feel really sad. While I do think that it did shed an important light on issues faced by women in online spaces, and I do think that in some ways representation of women in gaming has gotten better, especially by those who chose to listen instead of just closing their ears, I still feel so sad that it took such a large-scale harassment to get us to that point. Was it worth it? Probably not, especially not to people like Anita and Zoe. But I want to leave us on this last note. We don't have to end it here. We can still work to make it better. If we talk about it, if we share the victim stories and we listen instead of reacting, we can help make online spaces safer for everyone, because it's not just for cis men. Games and media are not just for them. They're for everyone. They're for all of us, and we all deserve to be included and have fun. Hi there! Thank you so much for watching. This video took me almost 6 months to make, so please be sure to like and subscribe to help the algorithm. Today's Patreon shoutout goes to Florence. Florence has been a long-time subscriber to our Patreon, and honestly, that means so much to me, especially considering there are times when I'm not able to create as much content as I want to, like right now while I'm going through my MFA program. But Florence, subscribers like you seriously have kept me going. You've put food on the table for Dr. Mew and Kiyoshi. You've ensured that I can get my daily dosage of Diet Coke, and I can also continue my education and content creation at the exact same time. So thank you again so much. If you'd like to be our next Patreon shout out, be sure to check out our Patreon link and YouTube memberships down below. We have some exclusive content for you to enjoy and some early reactions, plus talking to me in real time. Until then, I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Bye!